Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, where we help new and beginning teachers navigate through those crazy first years of teaching so you can maintain your sanity and personal life. Here's your host, Kim Lapre.
Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, episode number 27. I'm your host, Kim Lapre, and this is the podcast for new and beginning teachers who don't want to just survive those first few years, but actually thrive. I'm so excited to come out each week and share some insight on teaching that I hope will make it easier for you to know what to focus on so that you're not overwhelmed by all of the things that it seems like you need to do. Now, if you've enjoyed the Teachers Need Teachers podcast for the past 26 episodes, I'd love it if you could show your love by taking the time to leave a quick review and a rating over on whichever podcast player that you're listening on. And if this is your first time listening to this podcast, welcome. I hope you'll get a lot of value out of it, and we'll hit that subscribe button so that you won't miss a thing. Now, today I have a value-packed episode for you. It's with Laura Kebart of languageartsteachers.com, and we're going to dive into differentiation. And this is really a hot topic because not only are you expected to differentiate, it can feel really overwhelming and it can seem like it's a lot of work. Now, I'm not saying that differentiation is necessarily easy. It is something that we have to do, but Laura goes into different ways how you can streamline the process, make it happen in real time so that you don't have to keep planning for differentiation all of the time, but you can still be effective in the classroom. We go into so many different tips and myths and strategies that I think you might want to take notes on this one because she really does dive into a lot that I know all of you, whether you teach English or math or science or social studies, you're all going to get some value out of it. Now, if you stick around until the end, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about an offer that Laura has for you to help you with your administration when they have questions about your differentiation strategies. So stick around to the end for that. So here's my conversation with Laura. So Laura, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Great. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. And I know you and I have talked before about all things teaching and education related. So yeah, happy to be here and doing this again.
Awesome. Thank you. So for my listeners, could you please tell us about your teaching experience and how you came to your current position?
Sure. So I've been teaching English language arts, reading and writing for almost 20 years between grades 6 through 12 at the high school and middle school levels. I then transitioned into an instructional coaching role for 2 years recently. That was not what I thought it was going to be. I thought I was going to be supporting teachers and helping them teach in a way that allowed them to actually have a life outside of school and really helping them find that balance and run their classrooms in a way that alleviated stress and gave them back their time. Yeah, that's not what that was.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But in the meantime, I also started building a website to serve middle school English language arts teachers, because out of all the grade levels I've taught, that's definitely my favorite group. Mm-hmm. So my goal was to provide, realistic, engaging, easy to implement lesson plans. I mean, we're talking bell to bell lesson plan units, full units for the entire school year for grades 6, 7, and 8. Something that I really haven't seen a lot of online. And it's a need that teachers have because it's easy to, go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, mm-hmm. piecing random things together from random places online. And then you're up all night or you're up on the weekends trying to plan everything. So I wanted to create one place full of lessons that sequentially flow, that actually go together, that make sense, that are rigorous, that are engaging. So that's where I am right now. So I run the languageartsteachers.com website for middle school ELA teachers. And since we're here today to talk about differentiated instruction, I also can mention that I include specific ideas for differentiation within each week of lesson plans that I provide for the members of the community that I run. I believe it's such an important part of teaching. So as I was creating these resources for our members, I just couldn't possibly, create lesson plans without also including all the differentiated ideas for them to use each week. So happy to dive into this topic with you.
Right. And I think it's kind of funny that you had gone to be an instructional coach and do exactly what you're doing now on your own terms. And you can provide this for not just teachers in a particular building who may or may not want that coaching, but for, multiple people. Like, you have access to hundreds of people, and help them out that way, which I think is awesome.
Right. And that's, I left my former role as an instructional coach. Really, I was just kind of a puppet for the administrative team. I didn't really get to support teachers the way they needed to be supported. So what I'm doing now is I truly am supporting them based on their needs, what they really want and need. And so that's the best feeling in the world, is to be able to give them what they really, truly need and not be tied to what a school district is telling me to do.
So you had mentioned differentiation, and for new teachers who have heard the term differentiation and may have been exposed to it in their pre-service experience, they might not actually have any knowledge of it in the classroom. So what does that actually mean and look like?
Yeah, it's funny because there have been so many books and entire, workshops, everything around differentiation. And so you can get so far into it that you come out the other side and you're like, I'm not sure what differentiation is, because it's like you go so deep into it. It's just, what is this again? So to me, it's basically just the idea that students come to us with such, a wide variety of background knowledge and all kinds of different academic experiences and foundations, or lack thereof, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to meet them where they are and grow them from where they are up to help them meet grade level standards. So differentiation is a way for us to figure out where our kids are and start building them up to where they need to be. So you might think of working out or someone doing push-ups, right? So if the goal is that, let's just say hypothetically, if all adults should be able to do 25 push-ups, okay, well, you're going to have some adults who can already do 25 or 50. You're going to have some who cannot even do one.
Right.
You'll have some who can do 10 or 15. So if they all need to be doing 25 push-ups, are you going to, snap your fingers and say, okay, do 25. That's what you have to do. That's the goal. Well, so some people will be able to do that. A lot of people won't. So It's kind of like that with kids. You've got to figure out what they can do and then bridge that gap between what they can do and what they need to be doing. So that's really the purpose of differentiation, is to figure out where kids are and what are some different ways that we can try to bring our kids up to where they need to be. So it's not that students are getting a bunch of different skills. Mm-hmm. It's not that they're even doing a whole lot of different activities. They're all on the same skill. It's just that we're doing something different with that skill. We're doing whatever it takes to bring our kids from where they are to where they need to be with that skill.
Right. And I think of, I love your push-up analogy, because I think of, like group fitness classes, or I see at my gym, they lead these TRX band classes. And in my mind, I'm thinking, there's no way that I could do that right now with the current shape that I'm in. But there are other people who are like practically doing, handstands with the bands. But at the same time, the class leader has to differentiate her instructions so that everyone gets something out of it. The goal is to increase your fitness or to do, build a particular muscle group on that particular day. But everyone's coming in at a different fitness level or a different amount of already having muscle mass. So I think that really illuminates the whole idea of differentiation for new teachers.
Yeah, it does. And, the fitness example is so good because you think about that instructor in the moment. That instructor in that fitness class is an expert. Mm-hmm. That person can, off the top of her head or his head, that person knows how to differentiate for that person already doing the handstand. That instructor can give that person the next step, the next challenge. And then for someone who's, this is their first day in the class, They know how to bring it down and how to motivate and how to encourage that person. So at the end of the class, everyone has grown in some way. It looks different, but it's okay. And I guarantee that instructor did not have to write a 30-page lesson plan with all of it pre-planned either.
Exactly. So what are some myths or misconceptions about what differentiation supposedly has to be like?
That is such a good question. There are definitely some myths floating around. I think it's where a lot of the, just that feeling of chaos and overwhelm comes from when we think about differentiating for our students. So one of the myths is that learning shouldn't be a struggle. Like you'll hear parents or sometimes even administrators or counselors say things like, oh, well, this child is really struggling, as if it's a bad thing.
Right.
And I've had parents tell me, oh, he's struggling. Can't he do a different assignment? Well, they don't realize that without that struggle, there's no growth. Now, I don't want a kid going home and breaking down every night. That's not what I'm talking about. But it's just kind of like that workout example. When you're doing, let's say you're doing 8 reps with weights. Well, if you can do all 8 easily, you didn't grow. Those last 2 or 3 reps are supposed to be the ones that, your muscles are shaking, you're struggling, you're sweating, You're ready for it to be done, but that's where the growth happens. So I think one myth is that why are we so focused on not letting our kids struggle? Why do we focus on that? Why is that such a thing right now? We don't want them to struggle. We don't want them to be worried. We don't want them to be concerned or anxious. I get that. But at some point, they've got to grow and they have to build their own confidence. Hey, I didn't know how to do this before, but now I'm starting to get it. Now it's starting to click. So
I agree.
If it's easy, if it's easy, we're not growing them. They're not learning coping skills. They're not building grit. They're not building confidence.
And there's also some... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say it's such a confidence builder for a kid to go from not knowing how to do something to coming out on the other side and saying, okay, I figured it out, or, oh, I've got it now, or, oh, I really stuck with it and now I can do it. Now I can show someone else how to do it.
Well, and they have this learned helplessness too. A lot of students where, oh no, it's hard. I'm going to look up at the teacher and raise my hand, even though I've made no attempt to try it on my own because of fear of failure. So I think that it's true that they do need to struggle because, like you said, when they get past that struggle, just the amount of self-confidence from figuring it out on their own and that they don't need to ask for help, especially in the middle and upper grades where they want to be more independent and not have to constantly ask for help. I think that that's a really important skill for them, the grit, like you mentioned.
Right. And part of differentiation can also come down to helping students know what their options are for when they are struggling, helping them to realize, okay, I just went from this being easy for me to now I'm struggling a little bit. Okay, what are my options as a person? That's such a life skill. What is in my toolbox that I can pull from to figure this out? Mm-hmm. And that's part of differentiation too, is teaching our students that none of us are born knowing everything. We have to figure it out. Everything is figure outable, but
yeah.
we have to teach our kids that. And so that's part of differentiation is letting them know, yes, this is normal. It's a normal feeling. It's normal to feel uncomfortable when you're doing something new, but you will move past it. I'm not doing it for you, and I'm not giving you a different assignment right now just because you don't like it or just because you don't, Yeah. So that, and some of that goes back to really knowing your kids too. You know which ones really, really are struggling, and you know which ones just aren't used to having to struggle before.
Yes, I agree. So what's another myth?
So, yeah. So another myth that I see a lot of is when you hear those so-called gurus out there saying that or showing that differentiation has to mean a lot of different learning groups, like your whole classroom is split up and everyone's working on something different. Everybody has their own reading passage, or everyone has their own different set of questions, and the teacher is teaching each group differently, and grades are being recorded differently, and everybody has a different assessment. You're moving kids along at all these different times. I mean, that's a nightmare to think about, keeping up with everything. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I see these people, these gurus online or in interviews or, different videos and stuff. And I'm thinking that's not what it has to be. Or that sounds good in theory, but if you have more than 12 kids in your class, there's no way that's going to work. And that's just not the reality for most of us. It just doesn't have to be that way, though. Differentiation does not have to mean that every single person in the classroom gets something completely different.
Right.
It doesn't. Because at the end of the day, our world is not differentiated. So at the end of the day, there are certain skills that kids in that grade level have to be able to do in order to move on to the next grade level. The differentiation comes in where we can teach that skill or that standard in different ways so that we can reach as many kids as possible and give them as many opportunities as possible to work with the concept. It doesn't mean that everyone is doing something different all the time.
Right.
For sure. Another myth, another thing that I'm seeing more and more of too, is that differentiation means that teachers need to create these huge, long, complicated lesson plans with all these pre-planned questions and pre-planned student groups, and all the differentiation is planned out ahead of time for every lesson. And, okay, this student gets this question. That student gets that activity. And that's how I'm going to prove that I'm prepping for differentiation. But if you think about it, that's kind of terrible, because not only is the teacher spending hours and hours on lesson plans, but they're almost inadvertently locking their students into these pre-labeled boxes, assuming that, okay, my low kids are only going to be able to do this, so they get that activity. My high kids are all going to be able to do that, so they're going to get a separate activity for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think teachers are doing this because they want to. They're doing it because I think there's a lot of pressure from up above that says you need to reflect that differentiation is happening by putting it into your lesson plans. But this is taking it to the extreme, where you're already boxing up kids and saying, well, those are my low babies, so they're only getting this activity. Those are my high ones. They're going to be fine. They're going to get this activity.
Right.
We can't prejudge situations like that. Kids surprise us all the time.
I agree. And I've been asked, well, not me, but we've been asked before as a staff, what are you doing to differentiate for your ELs or for your students with IEPs, as if that somehow being an English language learner or having an IEP is a deficiency. Right. Do you know what I mean? So they want to know exactly what I'm going to do to ensure that they're successful. And to me, I'm thinking, I'm just going to teach them, and I'm going to help those who need it, regardless of whether or not they're an EL or they have an IEP, because I know my students that well.
Exactly. And it's good to have a basic plan in mind for kids who get it and are ready to move on. It's good to have a basic plan in mind for, a plan B, so to speak, for kids who aren't getting it. But a lot of true differentiation happens in the moment. It happens when you look at a kid's expression and you can tell you need to backtrack. Mm-hmm. Or you look at what a kid just wrote, or you listen to what a student says to another student, you think, whoa, okay, we need to up the game here. Wow, they're moving through this concept quickly. A lot of differentiation happens when a teacher is simply paying attention, and in the moment, they know how to move that kid. Mm-hmm. Those are not things you can really put down on a lesson plan.
No, you can't plan for that.
Basic, no, you can't. It's in the moment learning, and we can't reflect that in a lesson plan, nor can we always anticipate it. No. Now, as we get to know our kids and as the year moves on, there's a lot we can anticipate, and we should be anticipating. But does that mean that we need 30-page lesson plans with every possible scenario spelled out? That's not sustainable. And so that's the point when teachers throw up their hands and say, I hate differentiation. It's too hard.
Right.
Because that's making it too hard. That's making it way harder than it needs to be.
Yes, especially for a new teacher who's also trying to figure out classroom management and everything else that has to do with teaching, answering parent emails.
Right. It does. There's one more myth I'd like to bring up here. And that is that, I think I touched on this a moment ago, but differentiation does not have to require a ton of grading either. That's another issue with the overwhelm, is I have all these students doing all these different activities. That means I have all these different things to grade for all my classes. That's overwhelming and mind-boggling. But here's a specific example. let's say you have a worksheet with 10 questions on it, right? I know worksheet has such a dirty word these days, but we're just being real here. So you've got that worksheet with 10 questions on it. Maybe the first few questions are kind of those basic low-level questions. You're just using them to get started with a new concept or the new skill you're teaching. And then maybe the last few are those higher level, more evaluative questions. Mm-hmm. So if you see students who are flying through those more simplistic questions, just let them stop, right? Jump them ahead to the last couple questions and see how they do with that. Or just give them the last 2 or 3 questions to work on and check in with them to look for gaps or to look for misconceptions. And then your low-level questions can be saved and used only as needed. Like if you're seeing that students are way off base with their thinking. So for struggling learners, like why would you give them all 10 at once?
Right.
Why even give them 5? Maybe just circle 1 or 2 on their papers or take that worksheet and snip it in half.
Yeah.
And just give them a few. Do just those 1 or 2 or 3 questions and then check with each other or check in with you before assigning any more. I mean, that's an example. Differentiation can be as simple as that right there. It's just it could be a way of chunking what you're giving them. It could be a way of giving them that you're not holding them accountable. It's that you're giving them less at one time so that you can really see where they are so that you'll know, okay, can I give them a higher level question to work through, or do I need to pull them over to my teacher table to do some reteaching before we move on to number 3 or before we move on to number 4? Right. It just amounts to giving them more of that real time in the moment feedback. And then you can differentiate up or down based on how they're doing. And that's kind of an example of the real time in the moment differentiation I was talking about. And when you're talking about grading, think of how much less grading you have as a teacher now. Because if your students are only doing maybe 2 or 3 or 4 of the questions on that 10-question worksheet, that's a whole heck of a lot less grading for you than if you had just given every kid all 10 questions.
Well, and it can be overwhelming. Okay, let's take like math, for example, where there's, 10, like you said, 10 questions on a worksheet. If you have a student who struggles with math, that looks like a lot to them. And if you have a student who is above average, they're thinking, why do I have to do all of these? I already know how to do this. This is boring. So by, like you said, a student who's struggling, if they just have to focus on the first 2 or 3, that's manageable and they're not getting overwhelmed by the fact that there's 7 more. Whereas if you just give the hardest ones to the accelerated students, they can just, work on that instead of wasting time on the easy level ones.
Exactly. And here's another good way to differentiate. We're going to stay with that same example of the math classroom that you brought up. Let's say I'm a teacher, I teach math, and I'm going to pull 4 students to my teacher table. Let's say we're doing independent work. Let's say everybody has the same worksheet, okay? But here's where the differentiation comes in. I'm going to pull 4 random students to my teacher table, and I'm going to have each student look at number 1, let's say, and I know you solved number 1, and I see that you have the right answer. That doesn't matter. I want you to write out how you got that answer. I want you to write out your entire line of thinking for how you got that answer. So if you have a high-level student who got the right answer, are we sure that he or she really understood why the answer is that answer?
Right.
If we have a struggling student, can that struggling student really articulate how he or she got the answer? I would rather spend that amount of time on 1 or 2 questions than have them do all 10 questions. Because when you write out their thinking, literally write out the steps they went through, the thinking process, why they put a 6 and not a 5, why they put a positive and not a negative. That's very telling. You can find a lot of gaps in there. And it might surprise you that some of your higher level students actually have some gaps. And that's what happens when you start adding in new variables and suddenly they're missing questions. And that right there is a form of differentiation because you're giving students a chance to explain their thinking and for them to think through their own thinking. And it's the same worksheet, it's the same question, but you just differentiated.
I know that a lot of the Common Core right now, it's very meta, where they are asked, how did you get that? Why did you do that? And I think even when it comes to writing, it's important for students to also be very metacognitive about why did you choose that piece of evidence? How did you evaluate that evidence and decided that it really does support the topic sentence of your paragraph? So I like the idea of, depth versus breadth and that using that as a differentiation strategy.
For sure. Yes.
Now, what are some other simple strategies that new teachers can start out with because they are overwhelmed and they're still getting their feet wet? So what are some, maybe like one or two that they should have in their pocket always?
One really easy way to differentiate that takes almost no work except thinking is your questioning. Think about the way that you're asking questions. So this goes back to either narrowing or extending work you already have for your students. So if you're a brand new teacher and you've got that worksheet or you've got that reading passage or whatever it is that you have, you don't need to think of 16 new different activities for it. Just think about the way you're asking questions. So maybe instead of making, 3 different questions for 3 different levels of students, just stick with what you already have and do something a little different with how you're using it. For example, you could take a common, ordinary worksheet you already have. The key here is using something you already have, right? Mm-hmm. No need to recreate anything new. So you could take a worksheet with 10 questions. You could turn those 10 questions into 10 task cards where each one has a different question on it. Now, whether you literally make a card out of it or not is beside the point. You could take that worksheet, type up those questions in little squares and cut them out. Maybe it's not even cardstock. Who has time for that? It doesn't matter.
I know.
But you could strategically assign certain task cards to certain students. So you might have in your hand which ones are going to which students. Because at this point in the year, maybe you know enough about your kids to think, I'm just going to start out with this question for these kids and see how they handle it. And then in your back pocket, maybe literally in your back pocket, you have that next level question ready for them when they can show that they're ready. So you could assign all the task cards to all the students and then they could choose which one they're working on. Or you could strategically give certain questions to certain students. But basically what you're doing is you're narrowing down that original worksheet by turning it into task cards where students are only answering one question at a time. That's what I mean by narrowing or extending an assignment you already have.
Right.
So they're only answering one question at a time before they get the next task card. And I can almost guarantee if you give a student one question and maybe they've got 5 or 10 minutes for just that one question, the depth of your expectation is going to be so much higher than if you gave students all 10 questions. It becomes just something to check. Even if I'm a high-level, high-performing student, I get a list of 10 things. I want to check them off. I want to get them done, right?
Right, yeah.
If I'm a struggling student, I'm overwhelmed. So either way, if you give me one question and I have to answer it in the way that you have instructed me to answer it, I need full, complete sentences. I need to show my work, that kind of thing, then they have to do that before they can move on to the next task card. So some kids may end up getting 5 or 6 task cards because they're moving quickly through those questions. Other students might only have 1 or 2, and that's fine. And this goes back to, we were talking about myths earlier, is that I know some teachers get hung up on, well, but this kid only answered 2 questions, that one answered 6, so now they're all off. And now, they didn't do the same amount of work. They did do the same amount of work because the same effort it took this kid to answer 6 questions really well happened to be the same amount of effort it took this struggling one over here to answer 1 or 2. But you know what? If that kid answered those 1 or 2 questions correctly and with depth, that shows a lot more growth than if that kid was forced to answer all 10 questions at a shallow level.
Right.
So we don't need to think about things as far as, well, that kid answered 2 questions, that kid answered 6 questions. That's not what it's about. That's not the point. So at that point, if you've seen growth in your students from those task cards, whether they answered all of them or not, if you saw growth, that is a win for the day. You have won. Well, you can go home satisfied.
Well, and it makes it easier for grading as well, as you'd mentioned before, because you're not having to watch that one student with the 2 task cards struggle through 10 and have them answer all 10 incorrectly.
Right.
and then
exactly.
just sit there and pull your hair.
Yes. So if that student who had the 1 or 2 task cards who was struggling the whole time, if you were able to confer with that student, even just a quick 90-second conversation to get that student back on track and to have him or her show that now they've got the concept, now they answered it correctly, I would say that's a fantastic opportunity to record a grade that reflects his or her understanding.
Right.
Done. Yeah.
So what else should they have? So that I really like that one about narrowing it. I love the idea of the task cards too. I haven't used those in that way, and I have some definitely mixed classes. So I think I'm gonna employ that strategy as well. Thanks.
Right, and you can do it with something you already have. So if you have a handout, a worksheet, anything with 10, 15 questions on it, just retype them. It won't take any time to just retype it. Mm-hmm. Like set up a chart, on a Word document or in a Google Doc. And inside your chart, you can either copy and paste the question over, you can just retype it real fast, but there are your task cards. That's all there is to it.
Right.
Yeah. So another idea is that, you can implement differentiation during or after a task. It doesn't have to be something that's done before or ahead of time. It can be, but not necessarily. It can happen during or after a task. So, for instance, asking your students how they know something, like we talked about earlier, asking them how they figured something out, looking and listening for gaps in their understanding. But I would say especially with your so-called on-level students. So often they're overlooked because teachers are pulled in so many directions. Make sure you legally meet the needs of your GT kids. Make sure you legally meet the needs of your struggling students with their IEPs and their 504s.
Right.
Okay, what about the middle student? That average on-level student. So often, and we don't mean to do this. We're not doing this on purpose. It just happens. Well, those are my on-level students, so they're fine. Okay, but gaps become present when we ignore them over and over and over. And again, we're not doing it on purpose. It happens because our class periods are short and we're pulled in so many directions. Mm-hmm. So again, differentiating or looking for opportunities to differentiate either before or either during or after a task can help us not ignore our on-level students, because just because a student has an answer to a question that's correct doesn't mean they really understood why or how it's the answer. And we went into that a little bit earlier, but that's a prime example of really thinking about how you're going to differentiate during or after a task. And if the student can prove to you that they really do understand why an answer is the correct answer or is the best answer, mm-hmm. that's fantastic. You can go ahead and move that student on. They can go ahead and try that next level task card, if we're sticking with that example. So that's something to think about also. Instead of giving your students a worksheet with 10 questions on it and planning on, a 20-minute independent work time, maybe just give them 4 questions. And they still get those 20 minutes, but this time they're going deep with those 4 questions. And while they're going deep with those questions, you're asking them questions. You're wondering what they're thinking. You might be very, very surprised at gaps in their understanding when you allow time for this. And I would rather have them do 4 questions than 10. It's less for me to grade anyway.
Right. Absolutely. And that actually brings me to assessment. Like meaningful assessment, how does that play into a teacher's differentiation strategy? Okay, so I know we just talked about differentiation happening during or immediately following a new concept. Mm-hmm. So much of assessment as it relates to differentiated instruction should be formative, not summative. Right. I mean, it can be summative. And so, if you're a new teacher and we're throwing around a lot of lingo right now, summative assessments are those assessments you get at the end of a unit or at the end of a grading period that cover everything. So when I say formative assessment, I'm talking about those daily check-ins, those, conversing with your students or observing them as they work, talking with them about what they're thinking, maybe even a quick little exit ticket. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm talking about with formative assessments. Those are going to be so important when it comes to assessing how a student understands the concept. You as the teacher can then base your next teaching moves on what you're seeing and hearing. And those next teaching moves might be just knowing who can
move on to the next part of an assignment and who needs reteaching of the original content.
Right. And if you're recording, the student who's struggling and only did 1 to 2 questions, you should be either formally or informally recording how they did, as opposed to the student who jumped ahead. Even if they did 6 questions, you still only need to record what level they're at on that particular standard or skill anyway.
Yes.
Makes it so much easier.
Speaking of recording students, here's a huge favor is keep some kind of a clipboard or something. Keep it with you all the time, whether it's a spiral or a clipboard, something to write on. I like to keep a seating chart with me. Now, if you have flexible seating, and if you don't do that, you would want to maybe just have an attendance roster. But for me, I always had a seating chart. I wanted to know where my students were sitting and who was sitting where, and that's just how I rolled. But I had a seating chart every class, every time, every day. And as I had these quick little 30-second or 90-second check-ins with my students, if during that check-in, I could tell that they got the concept, that done. I just go immediately to where they're sitting on my little seating chart, and I would jot down a check or a check plus, maybe even a grade.
Nice.
Done. So I wasn't taking up all these assignments and grading them. I mean, you have to look for any opportunity to record information that shows where your students are. It doesn't always have to be you at home on a Friday night crying into your wine glass while you're trying to get your grading done.
Right.
Right. So when you're talking about assessing your students and when you're talking about differentiated instruction, when you have that aha moment and you notice that student got the concept, jot it down immediately. And so for me, it was easier to do it with a seating chart because I didn't have to try to think, oh, wait, what is her last name? Oh, I always forget her last name. No, right. I just look at where she's sitting. Oh, yeah, I know where she sits. And just right there on her little seat, I would jot down, okay, that's the grade I'm putting in the grade book because she got it.
Plus the feedback is all. Yes, exactly. I was going to say the feedback in real time is so valuable.
Yeah. And it's so exciting when you go to you're going to put a 100 in the grade book for this kid who got the concept. And it's so cool to be able to say, hey, whispering, I'm putting a 100 in the grade book because you explained that so well. I know you got the concept. They're like, woo. I mean, they're so excited.
I love that.
It's really meaningful. Yeah.
Because then it's a win for both of you. You feel like, yes, I was able to get them to where they need to be. And for them, I did all this work and it paid off. I worked really hard and I pushed through the struggle and it paid off. Right. Exactly. Yep. Now that's the part that we get to experience, the day-to-day joys in our classroom. But sometimes administrators, they're looking for something when they have that snapshot, if they do like a walkthrough or an observation. What are they looking for when they come and observe new teachers? And, in terms of keeping an eye out for differentiation? The number one thing administrators want to see in a classroom is engagement. They want to see student engagement. Absolutely. So when it comes to differentiation, what we're talking about here is making sure that you have the kind of classroom environment where students know how to talk about their learning. They know how to speak with each other about their learning. They want to see you talking with your students versus at your students, two different things, right? They want to see lots of how and why questions. Show me how you need to do that. What would happen if we did this instead? They want to see students doing more of the talking and the writing and the doing and posing the questions that get them to do this. Now, in an ideal world, students would be curious enough to where they're the ones asking the questions. Imagine you just taught a concept and you had students thinking, ooh, what if we changed this variable? Or what if we did that? Now, that's something that comes from, it can sometimes take a whole school year to get to that point. But ultimately, when it comes to differentiation, when administrators walk into your classroom, if they see students actively engaged and students talking and writing and doing, and you as the teacher posing those wide open questions,
That's a good thing. That is what they want to see. But this takes training your students how to do it. It takes a lot of modeling and practicing. It takes even using timers so that when you pose a question, your students know they have this amount of time to answer it. They know how to answer it, and they know what the expectation is for their answer. That takes a lot of training and prep work up front. It doesn't happen overnight. So it's something to strive for. Also, you as a teacher, it helps if you start recording question stems and then keeping them maybe on a sticky note or on an index card or on some kind of, a clipboard of some sort, so that they're with you all the time in your hand. So in the moment, anytime, any day, you've got maybe your favorite open-ended, really thought-provoking question stems that you can apply anytime. That way you're getting in the practice of asking those deep how and why and what would happen if questions. And then your students are used to you asking those questions too.
And if you blank when an administrator's in the room, you have it ready to go.
Yeah. And it's not bad at all for an administrator to see your own little, teacher cheat sheet. When I was working as an instructional coach, many times the administrators wanted to see the teachers with notes because that showed that they had put some thought into what they were doing. They put some thought into the questions they were asking. It's a good thing to have notes with you when you're walking, when they're walking into the room and they see you as a teacher look down at your little cheat sheet. They know that that's at the front of your mind, is providing your students with multiple opportunities to think that way and to talk that way. Now, so it's a good thing. You need your cheat sheet. It's good.
Now, what if they came in either regularly or semi-regularly and they're saying, you know what, I feel like I'm not seeing enough differentiation. What are some of the questions that they're going to ask you, and how can I be prepared with an answer?
I like that you bring that up, because those are questions not just that an administrator would pose to you as a teacher. Those are questions that will be posed to you in pretty much any teacher interview. So even if you're not teaching yet, you're going to get those types of questions about differentiation. So you might think, okay, so let's say an administrator walks into your room and says, why do your students all have the same assignment? Where's the differentiation? Well, think about it. After everything we've talked about today, maybe the way you're going to differentiate is in those how and why questions, those follow-up questions, right? That's not always reflected in your lessons or in the kids' activities. So let's say an administrator walks into your room. Why do your students all have the same assignment? Where's differentiation? Well, your answer to that could be, okay, well, I have high expectations, so all my students get access to the same grade level materials since the standards are the same for everyone, right? Nobody can argue with that.
Right.
Then you say, the differentiation happens in what we do with the skill I'm teaching. Here, let me show you what I mean. And then you can show your administrator the next step in the assignment. Since some of your students will be ready for that next step, other students will need some reteaching. You can literally say, yes, I have high expectations for all my students. They're all responsible for understanding this particular grade level standard. So the differentiation happens in what we do with the skill. Right. So these kids are ready to move forward. Here's what they're going to get. These kids desperately need some reteaching. So now here's what I'm going to give them to. So your administrator needs to be able to see that you're not backing down from the standard. That's why all students have the same assignment right now at this exact moment in time that you walked into my classroom. Right. And if you had walked in 20 minutes before, you would have seen the choice board that I gave them, but you didn't. So
exactly.
But really that's what it comes down to, is that differentiation does not mean that our students are doing different things. It means they're doing maybe some different things with the same skill. And that is why you're seeing them do the same thing right now. But here's what I'm doing to extend, and here's what I'm doing to scaffold. You're just not seeing it, but here's what it is. And you can hand them a form, or you can show them your notes that you jotted down you could even pull out work from the last class you had to show them, this is what my higher level students did when we were done. This is what my struggling learners did when we were done. I think administrators just need to feel, they need to feel confident that the teachers have this in mind, that you have a plan. And if you can explain your plan, they're going to be fine.
Awesome. Is there anything else that they might question us with, or just sort of not accuse us of not doing, but some questions that might make us feel a little bit defensive or worried that we're not differentiating enough.
Yeah, so often it feels like no matter what we're doing, it's not enough. I don't know that they do that on purpose. It is a real feeling though. And just the question, like, how are you differentiating for your students? I mean, that's a great interview question.
Right.
But how are you differentiating for your students? So I think the simplest answer you can give them is to talk about how really I differentiate by questioning them, by the way that I question them. You could even invite hey, stop by my classroom and watch how I use questions to push them past basic comprehension. Right. It comes down to the questions that you're asking, and the questions you're asking, that comes down to you knowing your students, knowing how they think, asking them how they're thinking or how they got that answer or what would happen if. It always goes back to those questions. And it's next to impossible to put all those questions in your lesson plan every single day for every single unit, for every single reading passage or science experiment, or, just to a certain extent, you can maybe do that a little bit, but it's just unrealistic to have 20 different questions for every possible differentiated situation.
Right.
Even in lesson plans, I work with some teachers, in my membership who, their principals want to see that differentiation has been planned for in their lesson plans. So, like they might say, where's the evidence of differentiation in your lesson plans? Well, so much good differentiation happens in the moment on the fly. Mm-hmm. But principals are held accountable too. They've got to be able to tell their superiors that, yes, our teachers are planning for differentiation and it's in their lesson plans. And to a certain extent it can be, but real differentiation is happening in the moment, every moment, all the time, in the way that you're talking with your kids and in the way that you're asking them questions. So one thing that I tell teachers to do is in the lesson plans, go ahead and just highlight one or two things here and there that you're planning to use for differentiation if and when your students are ready for it. So in other words, if you have 5 or 6 activities listed, learning activities listed for Monday, right? Maybe in the back of your mind, you're thinking, okay, my students really struggled on Friday. I don't think they're ready for activity 3 and 4 yet, but I'm going to go ahead and put those in my lesson plans and then highlight them because those are going to become my differentiated, from my higher performing students. Or if the material is really clicking with my students on Monday, then activity 3 and 4, that's the differentiation for my higher level students. I'm going to highlight the activity that I started on Friday because I'm going to make that my reteach lesson for kids who need that. So it's not that you're listing a whole bunch of different random things in your lesson plans to try to, quote, prove that you're planning for it. It's more like, what will I do if Monday comes and my students from Friday still don't get the concept? Well, I'm going to reteach that concept. I'm highlighting that in blue. Blue means I'm reteaching that to kids who need it.
Right.
And then what am I going to do for kids who, it just clicks. It clicks for them. They heard it a second time in my mini lesson and now they've got it. Now they're ready for the next point. What will the next point be? Well, I'll move them on to the next activity that I have ready to support their learning. I'm going to highlight that in yellow. So you can come up with a system as simple as that. Yellow means that's how I'm differentiating for my higher level learners. Blue means that's how I'm differentiating for my struggling learners. Just something so that you can show your administrators that it is on your mind, but at the same time, you're not going to create 16,000 different lesson plans for each kid.
Right. And they don't want to get, a 5-page lesson plan for one class period anyway. So you can almost train your administrator on your particular strategy as well.
Right. And if you can get the rest of your, if you're at a larger school where you have, several teachers within that grade level or within that content area, if you can get them all on the same page, that'll probably take a load off your administrator's shoulders. Mm-hmm. And that's going to make you very favorable in their eyes too.
You're going to be the hero.
Right. And it makes it easier for yourself. It's pressure off yourself too, because you might have those 5 or 6 things listed anyway in your lesson plans. All you're doing is showing which one you'll use if and when a kid needs some scaffolding, and which one you'll use if and when a kid is ready to move on. That's all it is.
Right. Oh my goodness, Laura, you have provided so much for my listeners. I'm pretty much blown away with this. And I know that on top of that, you've also been kind enough to create a resource for them. Can you give us more information on that?
Oh, yes, I sure can. Absolutely. So I've got a freebie for your audience. We talked here just a minute ago about some of the questions that come up that administrators or maybe even parents have for you about the way you're differentiating and are you doing enough? And, we went over 3 questions, I guess, related to that. I actually have a file that I will send you that has 10 questions all about differentiation that parents or administrators might have, along with how you can answer those questions.
Awesome.
So I will give you that for your audience. This is perfect for anything from like a new teacher interview to those awkward moments when you're being questioned about your differentiation and not always feeling like you're doing enough, even though you totally are doing enough. You feel that way when you're questioned. So this is a collection of 10 questions along with answers to help you articulate what you're doing in a way that satisfies parents or administrators' expectations. So the goal is that by the time you finish going through that freebie, you'll feel really confident about how to talk about what you're doing to differentiate. That's the goal. So I do have an online training about differentiation in the middle school English language arts classroom. So that link to sign up for the training will be in that freebie.
Awesome.
Yeah, so they'll be able to access that when they access the freebie as well with the 10 questions on it.
So you guys, I have actually done a workshop with Laura. We sort of co-taught a workshop on lesson planning for classroom management, and it was fabulous. And both of our audiences got so much out of that. So I highly encourage that you head on over to this workshop that she's holding, because you're going to get even more strategies on how to differentiate. And so this is something that all teachers should be doing. When you get that glazed over look from students when you're trying to teach something, the strategies that Laura provides on this are going to make it so that not only will you be more aware and know how to handle those in real time, but also how to already plan for those moments when students either are bored because they already know it or are terrified because they have no idea what's going on. So, Laura, thank you so much for giving my listeners the opportunity to attend that workshop.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about and to teach on. So happy to do it for sure.
That's awesome. And for those of you listening, I'm going to link to that in the show notes as well as the website so that you can go ahead and grab that. And one other thing that you had mentioned to me before, Laura, is that, today we talked about what differentiation is and why we should differentiate. But what if I still need more help on strategies and how to differentiate?
I do provide specific ideas for differentiation in each and every week of my lesson plans. So I'm over at languageartsteacher.com, and I serve middle school 6th, 7th, and 8th grade English language arts teachers through my 100% done for you lesson plans and instructional coaching. So you can visit me there if you need help with your lesson plan needs. If your goal is to go home earlier each day.
Yeah.
And to know, right, whose isn't. And if you need help with ensuring that each week has ideas in it for differentiation, that is all built into the lesson plans that I have for the members of my lesson plan community. It's already done.
Now, Laura had mentioned that she is at languageartsteachers.com, and that's her membership site. And Laura, where else can we find you, like on social media?
I have a really sweet, kind, generous group on Facebook, and our group is several thousand strong. Middle school English language arts teachers for grades 6, 7, and 8. And in fact, that's the name of the group. So you can go to Facebook and you can find us by just typing in middle school ELA teachers community for grades 6, 7, and 8. It's nothing fancy. It's just the name of it. So it's easy. Yeah, so we're on Facebook at middle school ELA teachers. Yes.
And you guys, I'm in this group as well. And Laura is in there all the time, also giving free mini workshops through Facebook Live. So if you are a middle school language arts teacher, I highly encourage you to join because you're going to get, some mini PD. I think you're doing this at least on a weekly basis, right?
I'm usually almost every week. Sometimes it's more like every 10 days. But yeah, my goal is to be in the group about once a week. And a lot of the trainings that I do, just the little mini Facebook Live trainings that I do, come from the questions that people in the group post. So that way I'm trying to bring some of the biggest issues, some of the biggest talking points forward by addressing them in Facebook Lives. Yes.
Those are perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Laura, for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to teach us all about differentiation today.
Thanks for having me, Kim. I was happy to be here and happy to do it.
All right, you guys, I told you that was going to be packed with so much information and value to help you with differentiation in your classroom, because let's just admit it, it's not necessarily easy, especially when you have a huge range of abilities in your class, but it's something that we have to do and that we have to get better at over time. So here are some of my key takeaways. Number one, differentiation does not have to be difficult. And Laura really wanted to drive this idea home that you don't need to keep planning for every little person or group that you're going to differentiate for. And in fact, another key takeaway was that some of the best differentiation happens in real time and on the spot. And a lot of times you can't really plan for certain types of differentiation. Also, a really effective and powerful way to differentiate is with the way that you question students to learn about their thinking. So you can have more surface level questions for students who are really struggling just to understand basic concepts. And then you can go deeper with analysis with your higher level students who are already grasping the main concepts and they need extension. So I really found that this conversation with Laura was so valuable, and I got a lot out of it as well. She had mentioned the task card method, which I know that I'm going to start using right away. And she just made me feel a little more reassured about implementing differentiation into my class, that it's possible even if you're really overwhelmed and stressed out as a teacher, which a lot of us are. So if you want to grab that resource that Laura had mentioned, I put a link in the show notes, and also you can go to teachersneedteachers.com/27, and there you'll be able to click on a link to grab that resource. And remember, it's a resource with 10 questions and answers that you may be asked by administrators or parents when they want to know about how you're differentiating in your classroom. So thanks again, you guys, for coming out and listening to this podcast. I want you to know that I really appreciate all of you. It's been a labor of love creating each episode, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. And I really hope that, if you get a chance, you'll leave a rating and review or subscribe and let me know how things are going on your end in terms of listening to the podcast. Have a fabulous day.
Thanks for listening to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast. Love this episode? Head over to Apple Podcast or Google Play to subscribe, rate, and leave a review.